entitled Reauthorization, addressing the historic disinvestment and ongoing plight of the Freedmen and the Native American communities. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes. The treatment of the original inhabitants of the North American continent has been a stain on the history of our great nation. The establishment and expansion of the United States included the seizure and forced removal of Native Americans from their homes, particularly under Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. Subsequent legislation continued to oppress and limit the mobility of Native Americans. The United States signed more than 370 treaties, passed laws, and instituted policies that have come to define the special government-to-government relationship between the federal and tribal governments. And that obligates the federal government to promote the general well-being of Native American tribes. Yet the United States has failed to provide that assistance. Native American communities continue to experience disproportionately high poverty rates and low incomes, overcrowding, chronic homelessness, and a lack of basic utilities such as plumbing, clean drinking water, and heat, and face barriers to housing and community development. In 1996, Congress passed the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, which provides federal funding to tribal areas via the Native American Housing Block Grant. That program is intended to support safe, decent, and affordable housing in tribal areas while respecting the tribal sovereignty. Today's hearing is focused on the need to reauthorize NAHASDA, which is the central statutory framework through which the federal government helps tribal governments improve housing and other infrastructure. We're also here today to understand the history of the Black Native American freedmen. If you're not familiar with this particular history, then I encourage you to take a good look and listening to this hearing today. Also, we're going to look at how certain tribes, including Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskegee Creek, and Seminole nations, known as the Five Tribes, purchased and enslaved Black people from Africa. The Five Tribes did sign treaty agreements and abolish slavery by freeing any enslaved individuals and agreed to treat them and their lineal descendants equal to native citizens. Today's hearing will discuss this turbulent history and how Congress may be used to ensure that all federally recognized tribes will receive the support and flexibility to make local decisions in how they serve low-income families. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman. She's not here yet. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hill, the ranking member of this committee.
Well, I thank the chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing today. I thank our panelists for being with us today. We're here to talk about the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act that we refer to as NAHASDA. In many ways, this hearing is long overdue, and there's much to discuss. In fact, other than a 2017 field hearing in Wisconsin held by former then-chairman Sean Duffy, this committee has not even had a hearing on NAHASDA in 14 years, going all the way back to June of 2007. Moreover, while NAHASDA has been amended several times since it was enacted, it's only been reauthorized twice, once in 2002, once in 2008. And the program is currently receiving appropriations from the Congress without authorization. That passive level of oversight bordering on apathy is no good way to run our government or to administer this program. But it's even more devastating given the extreme level of present need for too many of our 570 federally recognized American Indian and Alaskan Native tribes. It almost defies belief to witness the persistent pockets of poverty on tribal lands. According to a Brookings Institute report from 2019, child poverty rates among American Indians and Alaskan Natives are consistently exceeding 40% for almost the past 30 years. That's unacceptable to me, and I know it is to our chair and all the participants on our panel today. And we've got to figure out a more effective way to combat it. While there are many technical questions to discuss here, I think it's important that we ask some bigger questions in order to get to the heart of the matter of these reforms, such as, has NAHASDA been successful in accomplishing its objective? How can the tribes better leverage private capital to enhance their economic development opportunities? How can we better increase accountability for the use of NAHASDA funds while maintaining the core principle of tribal self-determination? After all, the worst thing anyone could take away from this hearing today is the notion that we just enact a new NAHASDA reauthorization and all the myriad problems and complexities in Indian country will simply go away. I wish that were the case, but life is never that simple. Still, anything worth doing is worth doing well, and good federal policy that leads to quality economic development, and with hard work and diligence, economic prosperity for our brothers and sisters on tribal lands is certainly worth our time and effort. Which brings me to another point about certain level of inescapable irony here. Just a week ago, we had the HUD Secretary, Secretary Fudge, sitting in this very room proclaiming that she had no idea how much COVID emergency rental assistance money had been approved by Congress last year and had gotten into the hands of distressed tenants. That quote came nearly after 6 weeks after I wrote Secretary Fudge a letter with my colleague from Illinois, Rodney Davis, and asked her in June, finding out why HUD has still not spent the CARES Act money from 16 months ago, a letter to which she has not yet responded. Such a level of irresponsibility and disengagement is the last thing the American people want to hear right now. And now, 1 week later, we're here talking about giving HUD more tribal rental assistance funding and expecting it to produce better and more productive results. Last week, some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle seemed willing to let accountability slip. Well, you can be assured on this side of the aisle, we do intend to hold HUD and others in the government accountable on their COVID emergency spending and on making sure every dollar authorized for NAHASDA ends up going to a worthy cause without any unnecessary delay. Our citizens who rely on programs like NAHASDA deserve the level of accountability from Washington, and I've tried a job at this hearing and oversight to ensure that every promise that we make is a promise that the U.S. government will keep. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the full Committee on Financial Services, the gentlewoman from Los Angeles, Ms. Waters.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, for convening this important meeting. Unequal access to housing sits at the heart of many racial and economic injustices across the country, including among Native American communities. The legacy of land and cultural dispossession has contributed to Native people experiencing, of course, high levels of chronic homelessness, overcrowding, and poor housing conditions. We also know that a key determinant of housing access on reservations is tribal citizenship, which is one of the barriers faced by descendants of Black Native American freedmen today. Many remain unaware of the ongoing plight of the descendants of freedmen, whose ancestors were held as enslaved people by 5 slave-holding tribes, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole. Today, under their 1866 treaty agreements with the United States government, these tribes must recognize descendants of freemen as tribal citizens and guarantee equal access to federal housing resources. While many confuse this issue with tribal sovereignty, I want to be clear that this is not a tribal sovereignty issue. Rather, it's about honoring the treaty rights promised to the freedmen and their descendants all those centuries ago. While it took decades of litigation, I'm pleased that Chief Hoskin is leading the Cherokee Nation to honor the rights of Cherokee freedmen. Other tribes must follow suit. Today, we are considering my legislation to address Native housing needs by reauthorizing the NAHASDA programs and guaranteeing equal access for all tribal citizens, including the descendants of freedmen. So I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. This is a fight that's about fairness and equality. For one minority group to discriminate against a minority group cannot stand. And as the chair of this committee, I don't intend for it to stand. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished panel. Thank you all for being here. First, we have Mr. Chuck Hoskins, the Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. Next, we have Mr. Chris Kolark, the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs with the Cook Inlet Housing Authority. Next, we have Ms. Marilyn Vann, the President of the Descendants of Freedmen of the Five Tribes Association. Next, we have Mr. Anthony Walters, the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council. And finally, we have Mr. Jackson Browsey, the Executive Director of the Native CFDI Network. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on the desk in the front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear, and I may tap very gently to remind you that your time is approaching the end. I would also ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Mr. Hoskin, you are now given 5 minutes.
OCO, hello in Cherokee. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm Chuck Hoskin, Jr., Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black once wrote that great nations, like great men, should keep their promises. I want to share a few words with you about Cherokee Nation's work to meet a promise that our nation made to the Cherokee Freedmen and their descendants through the Treaty of 1866. That treaty is a living, powerful, and foundational document, Mr. Chairman, that ties together all of the Cherokee Nation treaties that existed before it. When we speak of our most important treaty rights, from our reservation lands to our right to a delegate to the House of Representatives, what we're really pointing to is language in the Treaty of 1866 that says that all provisions of treaties heretofore ratified and in force are hereby reaffirmed and declared to be in full force. It's a document that we as Cherokees must defend and preserve. Article 9 of the treaty, Mr. Chairman, states that all freedmen and their descendants shall have all the rights of Native Cherokees, not some of the rights, Mr. Chairman, all of the rights of Native Cherokees. Now, we criticize the United States when it fails to live up to its treaty obligations, yet we have the same responsibility. So for Cherokee Nation, the issue of freedmen's citizenship was really settled 155 years ago in the treaty that we agreed to, that the Senate ratified and that the President of the United States signed. It was settled, Mr. Chairman, by our ancestors. Now, we talk a great deal in Cherokee culture about respecting our ancestors, seeking guidance from them. Well, they were clear in 1866. They agreed by treaty to forever cede the right to exclude freedmen and their descendants. Because of this, some of the actions taken by some of my predecessors to exclude freedmen were void ab initio. That is, Mr. Chairman, void from the beginning. Quite simply, Cherokee Nation has not possessed the ability since 1866 to deny full citizenship to freedmen. The enslavement of other human beings and the subsequent denial to them and their descendants of basic rights is a stain on the Cherokee Nation, and it is a stain that must be lifted. I offer both an apology on behalf of the Cherokee Nation for these actions, and more importantly, Mr. Chairman, I offer a commitment to reconciliation. I'm proud of the actions that we've taken over the last decade to begin to right these wrongs. We did not appeal the federal district court decision in the Nash case, which confirmed that the 1866 treaty is alive and well and preserves the rights of freedmen to have all the rights of Native Cherokees. The day after that historic decision in 2017, our own Cherokee Nation Supreme Court affirmed that same principle. The Nash decision is the law of the land in the Cherokee Nation. We immediately began processing applications for citizenship of freedmen descendants, and to this day, and on an ongoing basis, 8,500 applications for citizenship have been processed. Earlier this year, our Supreme Court determined that by blood language in our Constitution was also in violation of the Treaty of 1866, and that language was void also from its inception. Secretary Holland recently recognized that the Cherokee Nation had brought the longstanding issue of freedmen citizenship to a close and fulfilled our obligations when she approved our Constitution. But, Mr. Chairman, we know we must do more than just acknowledge the legal principle of equality. We have to embrace the spirit of equality every day, and we know it doesn't happen overnight. For more than a century, freedmen have been disconnected from the Cherokee Nation. They've not had the same experience as Cherokee citizens. We've got to bridge that gap. So to that end, I issued an executive order November 7th of last year on equality, to reaffirm equality in the Cherokee Nation, to knock down barriers to access to services and programs if they exist. We've also undertaken an effort to recognize and celebrate freedmen history and freedmen art so that we can celebrate our full history in the Cherokee Nation. Now, I want to close by saying that the reason I'm here today is because it's a moral imperative that I be here and that the Cherokee Nation recognize equality. I'm not here because of the 2008 NAHASDA rider that addressed the freedmen issue. We took these actions because it was the right thing to do. I don't believe Congress should condition federal housing policy and dollars on this type of public policy end. I think it breeds antipathy. I don't think it breeds understanding. But I will say this, Mr. Chairman, the Cherokee Nation is a better nation, a stronger nation for having kept its promise with respect to equality for freedmen. Widow.
Thank you, Mr. Hoskins. Mr. Walters, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'd like to thank Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing today and for inviting NAHC to provide testimony regarding NAHASDA. The committee uses the term historic disinvestment to describe the state of tribal housing programs. This is all too accurate. In FY 1998, the first year of NAHASDA, tribes received $600 million in the first year. In FY 2021, tribes received only $650 million for the same block grant. Factoring inflation, this small increase actually represents a cut of over 1/3 of the purchasing power of tribal housing programs. If the program had kept pace with inflation, the Indian housing block grant today should equal $994 million. In these same 20 years, the HUD budget has almost doubled. Despite the funding shortfall, tribes support NAHASDA and have been successful through the program. According to HUD, since NAHASDA was created, tribes have built over 40,000 affordable housing units and rehabilitated over 100,000 more. Unfortunately, and also according to HUD, 68,000 units today are needed in tribal communities to address substandard homes and to alleviate overcrowded conditions, which Native homes experience at nearly 8 times the national average. You may ask what tribes are doing with the block grant funds they currently receive. And we ask tribes to do a lot with that funding. Tribes are tasked with maintaining tens of thousands of tribally owned housing units across the country that have been developed over decades and are now aging and needing constant repairs. Tribes are also asked to provide low-income rental assistance, provide student housing assistance, housing and supportive services for veterans and elders, housing counseling services for prospective homebuyers, paying the operating costs for their own housing programs, and we expect them to build new homes each year. Nearly 600 tribes receive funds through NAHASDA, and they are expected to carry out all of these services with only $650 million in the block grant. Approximately 400 or 2/3 of those tribes receive less than $500,000 a year to do all these activities, and 175 of these grantees receive less than $100,000 to do these housing activities. So it shouldn't be hard to see why we're falling behind. The United States Commission on Civil Rights issued a report in 2018 entitled Broken Promises, just 3 years ago. It found that since 2003, when the Commission on Civil Rights first reported on the housing crisis in Indian country, the situation had deteriorated further. The report stated that according to HUD, between 2003 and 15, the number of overcrowded households without adequate kitchens or plumbing grew by 20%, from 90,000 households to 110,000 households. The number of families with severe housing costs grew by 55% to 65,000 families. That is all in this century. That is just these past 20 years. We are letting things get worse in our tribal communities. But we can change that. This Congress can change that. Let's celebrate the 25th anniversary of NAHASDA this year by recommitting ourselves to fully supporting housing development in Indian country. NAHC stands ready to work with any and every member of Congress to address these housing issues. The current draft NAHASDA bill has a lot of great pieces. It contains some program improvement that tribes have been asking for years. It includes proposals that will make housing development easier, including simplifying environmental reviews for housing, relaxing flood insurance program requirements that would place tribes on the same footing as states. It would make the HUD-VASH program for tribal veterans permanent and open to all tribal communities. Currently, the program only serves veterans in 27 of the 574 tribes. The bill would also create substantial set-asides for USDA programs that seem like a perfect fit for tribal communities, but have historically had little impact. One area where the current draft falls short is the authorization levels. While NAHC supports reauthorization, the draft bill would cap authorizations for the next 5 years, starting at current funding levels. This would essentially mean tribes will always be capped at 2/3 the purchasing power that they originally negotiated for through NAHASDA. NAHC, as a tribal membership organization, also believes that provisions like Section 604 that target individual tribes should be discouraged from a larger housing bill without that tribe's support. The particular issue of the hearing today is also considered a membership issue by NAHC and thus should be treated as such and not directed into a housing program reauthorization. Prior to NAHASDA, tribes were piecing their housing programs together with various grants and funding sources. Despite the original promise of the Consolidated Block Grant, 25 years later, tribes are again piecing their housing programs together. While tribes can and are leveraging resources from various federal programs, it's not easy. Tribes are often confronted with a multitude of differing eligibility requirements, environmental reviews, and program rules. So what can we do and what can Congress do? To end my comments, we can keep improving NAHASDA, we can reauthorize NAHASDA, and we can keep ensuring that national housing programs are also effective in Indian country. And we have to reverse the historic disinvestment and call on Congress, federal agencies, tribes, and the private sector to act. We must recognize that housing development in tribal communities will rarely have the economies of scale that drive housing development in other areas, and we have to invest anyway, because it is needed in our tribal communities, because it is a promise the United States made to tribal nations. With that, I will end my statement. NAHC has submitted additional comments for the record. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you again for your support in improving housing opportunities for tribal communities across the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. Ms. Vann, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation.
Greetings, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the House Financial Services Committee. I'm Marilyn Vann.
Your microphone, probably. Yes.
Okay. Greetings, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the House Financial Services Committee. I'm Marilyn Vann, President of the Descendants of Freedmen with the 5 Civilized Tribes Association. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation and a Freedmen descendant. The organization supports enforcement of 1866 treaty rights of descendants of freedmen who face discrimination in tribal registration and accessing federal funded services. I want to thank the subcommittee for holding this hearing. And I want to thank Chairman Waters and staff for support of the Freedmen and NAHASDA. Today I request the members support Title VI, Section 604 compliance section in the final NAHASDA reauthorization bill that is adopted by Congress. If adopted as written, Secretary of HUD would be authorized to reduce or withhold NAHASDA for one or more of the 5 tribes that such tribe is found to be in violation of its 1866 treaty obligations to freedmen descendants that were registered on the Dawes rolls. I point out that none of these received degrees of blood. The rolls were approved by Congress in 1907. Currently, only the Cherokee Nation works to fulfill its treaty obligations to freedmen descendants. Almost all of the freedmen were black slaves of tribal members. Prior to the Civil War, the tribes allied with the Confederate States to protect slavery, and at the end of the Civil War, signed new treaties with the U.S. These treaties granted the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole freedmen, their descendants, the rights of Native Indians and citizenship. Many of the descendants of freedmen today are impoverished and in need of housing due to no fault of their own. This began during slavery when there were black codes, slave codes. Blacks were barred from education, acquired assets. later suffering race massacres like in Tulsa, Jim Crow laws, and redlining from the U.S. government. Starting in 1979, tribal nations passed laws to exclude freedmen or treat freedmen descendants as second-class citizens. Blacks in Oklahoma have lower home ownership rates and lower income than Native Americans, and both communities less than whites. As a result of past and current systemic racism, descendants of freedmen have substantial housing needs. Some who need assistance include such freedmen, Creek Freedmen descendants as Mr. Lovett of Okmulgee, a senior citizen on disability who needs rental assistance. He's had a double lung transplant. Mrs. Wilson of Okmulgee, a widowed senior citizen who desperately needs a roof. She has a tarp on her roof, needing housing repairs. Ms. Rice of Okmulgee, a single mom who works a part-time job and is a student, needing rental assistance, tried to get from the Creek Nation but was turned away. Now, can the tribes change without, I should say, will the tribes change without federal intervention? History says no. Cherokee Nation only came into compliance after federal court decisions in Cherokee Nation versus Nash and Van versus Zinke cases. And passage of the Freedmen protective language in the 2008 NAHASDA Reauthorization Act, and at great personal cost to the Freedmen descendants and their allies. The nation spent millions to exclude freedmen in the previous administrations. Some council persons and candidates for office still oppose freedmen citizenship. I appreciate the former Chief Baker and Chief Hoskins for what they have done to honor the treaties. Moving on to the Seminole Nation, they exclude freedmen descendants from receiving services even after they lost Seminole Nation versus Norton case in 2001. They've recategorized the freedmen as citizens rather than members, reissuing the freedmen tribal membership cards to say 00, blood quantum, and voting privileges only. And they tell other tribes that freedmen do not qualify for services, and in spite of the DOI and HUD instructing the tribe that freedmen descendants do qualify for services. In the Muskogee Creek Nation, the leadership stated that dialogue is needed about freedmen, but does nothing. The tribe stresses validity of the 1866 Treaty Article 3, which confirms the Creek Reservation, see the McGirt case, but is silent about Article 2 of the treaty, granting freedmen the rights to share in national funds. In conclusion, the tribal governments receive monies for the housing programs, but the majority of freedmen are excluded. I ask you include the treaty obligation language in the final bill and support its passage in the full House. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kolarok, you are now awarded 5 minutes for your oral presentation.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Chris Kolarok. I am Chupik Eskimo, a member of the native village of Makoriak, and I am the Director of Public Policy at Cook Inlet Housing Authority, the tribally designated housing entity for the Cook Inlet region of Alaska. I was unanimously voted as the Legislative Committee Chair of the Association of Alaska Housing Authorities and unanimously voted as board member for the National American Indian Housing Council. My comments today represent all of the 14 regional housing authorities that cover every geographic corner and native population group in Alaska. I and my Alaskan colleagues thank Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Waters for her respect of tribal self-determination and the goal of distributing funding without administrative burden or waste by allocating Indian housing funds through the NAHASDA formula in the Housing as Infrastructure Act of 2021. Why do we need investments in Indian housing and NAHASDA reauthorized? We do not have enough homes, and the homes we do have are often decrepit. Nationally, we need 33,000 new homes to alleviate overcrowding in Indian country today. The homes we do have are nearly 5 times as likely to have a physical deficiency as average, including lacking running water, or having electrical systems that are a fire hazard. Closer to home in the Yukon-Kuskokwim region of Alaska, 40% of homes are either overcrowded or severely overcrowded, and 35% lack complete plumbing. Well, what does this look like and what does this actually mean? I have seen with my own eyes in Brevig Mission, Alaska, an 1,100 square foot, 3-bedroom home with 18 people living in it. With that many people, there are not enough bedrooms. There are not enough surfaces for everyone to sleep at the same time. Instead, they must sleep in shifts. In the hope that their children will grow up with a better life, some people sleep the day shift so that their children can sleep at night and attend school in the morning. Those people will never wake up in the morning for a job. Their children cannot learn at school if their home is too overcrowded to sleep, or they carry the stress from that overcrowded home into school. Those children will face difficulty getting a job forever if they cannot read, write, or do basic math. When 18 people share a home and one person suffers substance abuse disorder, 17 other people suffer from that affliction. There was at least one, and usually multiple, homes like this in every village I served when I was the president of the Bering Straits Regional Housing Authority in Northwest Alaska. How did we get here? It is an oversimplification, but true, that past Congresses and presidents forgot about us. The Indian Housing Block Grant 20 years ago, FY01, was $640 million. Last year, it was $647 million. HUD's budget 20 years ago was $28 billion, and last year it was $60 billion. There is a long-running inequity in the distribution of new funding to HUD. Beginning to address this inequity is difficult, but I thank this subcommittee for doing this work. Second, there are no homeless people at 40 degrees below zero. So what do we do going forward? I respectfully request the House and Senate reauthorize NAHASDA. I also support the funding mechanism for Indian housing in the Housing as Infrastructure Act. I thank Chairwoman Waters again for her recognition and respect for self-determination in this act. The NAHASDA formula works. It takes the many variables that quantify housing need and creates a single allocation that is non-competitive and highly efficient to distribute. Self-determination is respected by the formula because it is a consensus model that was negotiated amongst all tribes and HUD representing the federal government. In the 25 years before NAHASDA, Cook Inlet Housing Authority was able to construct 267 housing units, and in the 25 years after, we have constructed over 1,500. Competitive programs that change from year to year that tribes cannot count on may be effective at achieving certain short-term goals. They do not, however, provide for long-term operation of affordable housing units, and they take us back to pre-NAHASDA days when we competed with each other and had Washington tell us what we needed. I thank the subcommittee again for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Mr. Kolarok. Mr. Brasi, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation.
Yate, Doke, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jackson Brasi, and I am the Executive Director for the Native CDFI Network. We are the only national member organization of community development financial institutions that serve Native communities across the country. I'm also a member of the Navajo Nation, and the subject of this hearing is near and dear to my heart, so thank you. At NCN, our member organization serves 27 different states, our members provide access to capital for first-time homeowners, micro-entrepreneurs, consumers, and those who are often unable to get a conventional bank loan and live in redlined areas across the country and in Indian country particularly. Yes, Indian country has been historically and currently is still being redlined when it comes to access to capital and housing finance. Redlining programs, and underinvestment in programs like NAHASDA and the CDFI fund, and the lack of access to capital contribute to the situation where Natives currently live in substandard housing, as this committee has, or this panel has wonderfully and explicitly described. It's a situation where more than 30% of members of the Navajo Nation have access to running water in their homes. It's a situation where there's severe overcrowding, a rate of 700% of what it is in the rest of the country. And this is unacceptable. There are also problems with financial literacy, access to credit, and the prices that Indigenous people pay when they finally do get access to a loan. The Federal Reserve recently found that Native Americans living on reservations who want to buy homes are significantly more likely to have high-priced mortgages, and those mortgages often are up to 2% more, 2 percentage points more than non-Native Americans get in the same house. This means that a Native American family purchasing a house for $140,000 on a reservation could pay up to $100,000 more over the lifetime of a 30-year loan. Problems of higher costs of home ownership and redlining in Indian country are unacceptable, and I'm here to bring a solution to the table. And that solution is Native CDFIs. Native CDFIs across the country are doing our part to address this untenable situation, and we can use all the help and investment to make a greater impact on this problem. There are 69 Treasury certified Native CDFIs across the country, and they provide access to capital to those who are unbanked, underbanked, financial literacy, and technical assistance. These Native CDFIs operate a wide spectrum of organizations and include tribally sponsored CDFIs, like the Citizen Potawatomi Development Corporation of Oklahoma, and the majority of Native CDFIs, which are nonprofit loan funds, like the Native 360 Loan Fund out of Nebraska. Native CDFIs can offer home ownership loans, down payment assistance, and home buyer training so that new homeowners have the tools to keep their homes and build a solid foundation for their family. And aligned with the spirit of NAHASDA, Native CDFIs are self-determination in action. They carry out the mission of NAHASDA and the CDFI Fund by increasing home ownership and utilize both HUD opportunities such as the Section 184 loan guarantees, HUD counseling, and other existing federal programs such as the USDA Home Loan Direct Program and the Veterans Affairs Native American Home Loan Direct Program and the Federal Home Loan Bank System. However, these tools can be improved upon, and we make some recommendations detailed in our written comments, but one area I wanted to bring up was with coordination between the Department of Interior and HUD around this slow turnaround for title status reports. We also wanted to highlight a great program at the USDA called the USDA 502 Direct Program that is really making a difference. In 2019, there were 6,194 direct loans made by this program. Of those 6,000 loans, only 2 of them were made on tribal trust land. Thanks to a great pilot in South Dakota, Native CDFIs like the Four-Bands Community Development are making a big difference, and we urge Congress to expand this pilot. And to wrap things up, the pandemic has pulled back the veil around the challenge of inadequate and poor housing in Native communities. I urge Congress and this committee to build upon the focus of this hearing and support the spirit of self-determination in NAHASDA. It's time to provide the resources to fund housing efforts and to eliminate barriers to utilizing other existing housing tools. Native CDFIs stand ready to work and help in this progress, and I know that we commit fully to working with Congress to help alleviate this problem and making sure that Native people have fair access to housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brasi, for your testimony. Thank all of you for your testimony. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Hoskin, I'd like for you, if you would, to describe any efforts that the Cherokee Nation has taken to ensure that your members can access affordable prime mortgages. And what is the nation going to do to help its membership overcome the the barriers as limited credit histories. And how can NAHASDA reauthorization help address these barriers?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Cherokee Nation, we are focused on building past to home ownership. One way in which we do that is a mortgage assistance program, and we use some resources to help people with down payments. But I think more important than that, create an environment where they can get credit counseling, build their credit up as they need to access mortgages, including the HUD 184 program, which has been a successful program for Cherokee citizens. Those programs have proven successful so far, and as we go into our next fiscal year, we are determined to commit even more resources to those types of opportunities for home ownership. At Cherokee Nation, we believe that everyone needs to have their housing needs addressed. There are different levels. For those, though, that are on their way to home ownership or could be counseled in a way that could get themselves worthy of credit, we want to help them get to a mortgage, and the mortgage assistance program that we offer has been very successful.
Now, I'm talking about prime mortgage financing.
So through our prime mortgage financing, we do work with a number of banks in our region. We do have good relationships with our banks. There are barriers, certainly, but the mortgage assistance program does pair them with mortgages through banks, but we provide some cash assistance to help them with things like down payments and things of that nature, Mr. Chairman.
We had the credit rating agencies here last week, I think it was, a week before, I'm not sure. Is that a problem as well, the credit histories of those seeking prime mortgages?
Certainly it is. Certainly those are barriers, and that's where our staff that works with citizens on counseling and identifying what has hit their credit history, that is where we address that. But certainly it is a barrier to homeownership.
Are there, I had questions for everybody. I got into this, I apologize. The credit history issue, are there alternative ways in which we could develop tribal credit history? I mean, another system of measurement.
Well, that's an interesting concept, Mr. Chairman. I think that would be something to explore. There are some loans that we offer that are not, in fact, reported to the credit agencies, which is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we can help some of our people get access to credit. I'm not talking mortgage, but access to credit when they are in need of a non-predatory lender. But it also takes them out of building a credit history. So we're sort of beholden to the credit history reports, and exploring a way to expand that in Indian country would be of interest.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up with some discussion with you on that. Mr. Kolarok, are there some unique housing challenges that you face in Alaska that perhaps we would not normally even think about?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I think about housing in rural Alaska, I like to think about a community called Savunga. It is 150 miles into the Bering Sea. It is closer to Russia than it is to the coast of Alaska. There are no roads to this island, and in this community, the ice only allows ocean transport from July through September. So not just there, but if you think about how do you build a home, and you think about the distance across Alaska, logistics is one of our biggest cost drivers. And logistics has risen in cost faster than the consumer price index. So as we talk about the difficulty of building homes now versus 20 years ago, we have to remember that the funding has stayed the same, but the cost of getting the material to an isolated, very small community has gone up over 70%.
Wow. My time is up. I now recognize the ranking member from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank our panelists for a good set of presentations. Mr. Brossi, when we look at some of the many families that are living on tribal lands, we too often, as I said in my opening statement, see the staggering and persistent poverty. And I mentioned in my opening statement this 2019 Brookings Institute report that found child poverty rates for the tribes have consistently exceeded 40% over the past 30 years. That's just, it's a staggering number. Now, NAHASDA exists to help attack part of that problem on the housing side. And I'm interested in better understanding what can be done to fight tribal poverty, more broadly. So since you represent the CDFIs working on tribal lands, can you talk a little bit about how tribes are leveraging private capital for both jobs and other economic opportunity on tribal lands?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to take a step back and maybe address how did the generational wealth and transfer, and how do we best set up our Native students and children for financial opportunity and growth moving forward. I think the Native CDFIs are helping with that. The tribes are obviously doing a part of that, and that includes financial literacy, building up credit so that they are able to transfer wealth onto their next generation. And then when it comes to accessing financial markets, tribes are doing great things with the program. They're doing great things with Title VI of NAHASDA, and I think that is an area that our members are looking to look more closely at. I think it's something that is underutilized. But bringing it back to CDFIs, I do believe that the change that can happen in a generation from now is around financial literacy, credit building for young entrepreneurs and young consumers right now that will impact generations and families moving forward.
Thanks. And going back to the housing issue, looking at the Section 184 loan guarantee program, it seems that those programs are chronically, undersubscribed. HUD says that the Title VI programs only generated about 100 loans worth $252 million over the whole history of the Act. And then the Section 184 program has generated 46,000 loans over its history. Can you talk to us about why these guarantee programs aren't more active and what barriers currently exist on getting them used? You referenced tribal lands and access to tribal lands. So mention in your answer if there's bureaucratic issues at BIA on clearing land title, and just what are some of those barriers?
There are significant delays in Department of Interior and BIA returning around things called title status reports.
What should be reasonable there?
I should be able to get something done in 30 days. I think if it
And
was
what's typical?
I don't know, but I've heard months and half a year to 6 months where deals fall apart. Obviously, the housing market is going up and valuations change.
Right.
And there also is an issue with coordination between the Department of Interior and Housing and Urban Development. And within this past year, there was a brief stall of taking on Section 184 loans. And we think that's unacceptable. Also in our comments, we say that there's an opportunity for Native CDFIs to be the lender right now. Many in the private sector, the large banks have backed out of doing the Section 184 loans. Native CDFIs are ready to step in, but we need to make.
And what's the key reason why the banks are stepped away from it?
I can't speak to that. I mean, bringing somebody from the bank in, but I guess designing this type of program for the market segment is cumbersome to the larger banks, and they are not able to take advantages of economies of scale. Whereas Native CDFIs, we'd serve our community, we'd be able to do it right away.
So you referenced the USDA 502 direct loan program in your remarks and said that you were pleased with that pilot. Tell us more about that.
Great. It's a great pilot in South Dakota. One of our members, the Four Bands Community Development, Four Bands Fund in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, has been able to create a pipeline of loans in rural development on tribal trust land, which, going back to the issue of getting these title status reports, has been really challenging and difficult. And like I said, the year before, there were only 6 out of 6,000 of these direct loans that were made on tribal trust land. That's flipped it on its head in South Dakota. We want to see it expanded. There's a great bipartisan bill in the Senate. We'd love your support. We'd love the committee to move it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Rossi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now yields to the chair of the full Financial Services Committee, Ms. Waters.
Today, we're here to discuss the chronic housing and community development needs of Native American communities and the reauthorization of Native housing programs. However, we must ensure that federal funds are not used to perpetuate anti-Blackness and racial injustice. Not many are familiar with the history of those who came to be known as the Freedmen. The Freedmen were Black individuals who were enslaved by 5 formerly slave-holding tribal nations. The Freedmen were forced to walk the Trail of Tears alongside their slave masters, and at the end of the Civil War, were guaranteed full tribal citizenship under treaty agreements between these formerly slave-holding tribes and the United States government in 1866. While tribes like the Cherokee Nation have begun to make good on that promise after decades of litigation, others have not. To this day, there are descendants of Native American freedmen who are denied the full benefits of equal citizenship in certain tribes based on their African ancestry. Ms. Van, first of all, before I say thank you to you, I want to say thank you to Chuck Hoskin, Jr., Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation here today and the way that you describe what is right and what is fair. And so I would hope that the other tribes would follow suit. But as I have gone through understanding each of these tribes, I'm understanding that they have no intentions of doing it. And, you know, once somebody said, well, let this issue be settled in the courts. Well, there's some that haven't even started to even talk about going to the courts. They just don't do it. And they just don't want to do it. And so, Ms. Van, I'd like to say thank you for never wavering on your fight for human dignity and equal recognition as a descendant of freedmen, despite the complex layers of what it means to be both Black and Indigenous. I know that it's not been easy. Your tireless efforts paid off when the Cherokee Nation finally began to recognize you and follow descendants of freedmen as equal citizens of the Cherokee Nation. However, the fight continues for many other freedmen descendants of other tribal nations that continue to disenfranchise and marginalize them. Your organization represents descendants of freedmen from all of these tribes. Can you tell us about the ongoing struggle for those descendants of freedmen who continue to be discriminated against despite treaty obligations that should protect them? Are they in need of housing? Are they in need of health care? Or just as we're talking about reauthorization and we're talking about how desperate it is for everybody, are the descendants desperate also? Do they need to share in these appropriations that they get from the federal government? And I want to tell with CDFI, of course, we're responsible for CDFI funding right here in this committee. And we did a great job in giving COVID money to all of the tribes. And I won't go through the numbers. Let Ms. Van please respond to my question.
Greetings, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you again. Yes, ma'am, the descendants of freedmen people, they are in desperate need of housing as well as other programs. I really didn't have time to get into the Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen, but yes, ma'am, they also have great needs too. We have here 2 representatives of the Seminole Nation, the Freedmen bands. They are in the Seminole Nation, for instance. There are persons who cannot, who have homes they can no longer live in. Desperate poverty among the Freedmen people. You were talking about other services, medical services. Within the pandemic, Freedmen not being able to get shots, and Seminole Nation telling IHS.
As I understand it, interrupt you just for a minute. The Seminole denied vaccination for COVID-19, despite the fact that we had given the money to all of the tribes. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. They had told IHS and gave them a list of people to not serve them with vaccinations, and people died, including leaders of the Freedmen people. That's correct.
I don't know what else to say.
Yes,
the
ma'am.
case is very clear. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this meeting. It's so very important. But I want to tell you, this issue is not going to go away. I am going to work on this issue until we get the right thing done. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlewoman from California for her prophetic comments. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill, for organizing this hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for your time here today. As Congress considers reauthorizing NAHASDA, it is important to acknowledge which parts of the program have worked well. One of the core tenets of NAHASDA is the flexible nature of the block grant, which allows for self-determination by tribes. Could each of you on the panel discuss how the flexibilities included in this program have allowed Native communities to develop units compared to the number developed when they received multiple single-use streams of funding from HUD? And Mr. Brasi, if you would start.
So, taking a step back, the majority of members of our organization are not tribally designated housing entities. So most of ours don't directly receive the block grant. However, there are a few Native CD5s that do have, or that are subsidiaries of a TDHG. There's a great example in Alaska, the Tlingit and Haida, and they are able to work with the Treasury to create a program where they're able to provide financing for working class members that might otherwise make too much to participate in a lot of HUD programs, but still don't have the credit history to get a conventional loan. And so they're able to find and finance that gap there. And I think that is also an area I think a lot of folks on the panel might have some thoughts about.
Sure, and if we would start with Mr. Walters and work our way across the panel.
Sure, thank you. I think, you're right. When you talk about the flexibilities provided under NAHASDA, each tribe is submitting their own Indian housing plan each year that addresses their unique community needs. Tribes are different based on their geography, where they are across the country, how urban they are, how rural they are. So giving the funds directly to tribes through a consolidated block grant has worked wonders over the last 20 years. In the beginning years of NAHASDA, they were outproducing the prior years under HUD funding and under HUD control of their housing programs. They were building more new homes under NAHASDA than before NAHASDA was enacted. That has gone down due to the stagnant levels of NAHASDA funding.
Mr. Walters, pull your microphone.
But tribes have overall been very successful with NAHASDA and very much support the program and wish it to continue.
And Chief Hoskin, would you like to address that?
Certainly briefly, the direct funding of NAHASDA and the ability to craft Indian housing plans has been indispensable for the Cherokee Nation. Indian country is not a monolith. You'll find different needs on the Cherokee Reservation than you will elsewhere, and our ability to craft those programs is important. So we certainly support reauthorization and the flexibility that comes with it.
Would either of the rest of you like to add anything there?
Well, I'll go ahead and add something here. I certainly believe that NAHASDA should be flexible. I believe in tribal sovereignty, only that tribes need to follow the law. And so, but each tribe, for instance, as earlier said, geography, the needs of the tribe, some places there may be more rental assistance needed or such. And so I agree in that flexibility, but not in issues, for instance, say where it's blood quantum or those kind of things are used to determine the services for the members of the tribe.
Keller.
So Cook Inlet Housing Authority, in the 25 years before NAHASDA, built 267 housing units, and in the 25 years after NAHASDA has built over 1,500. NAHASDA put control of housing where it should be, which is in the hands of the tribes. Prior to that, there were strict limits on housing costs. There was design standards, and that legacy is still visible today. Homes designed in California and shipped up whole are sitting decaying and decrepit in our Alaskan villages right now. Unshackling us from HUD's mandates allowed us to get creative. Cook Inlet Housing Authority was the first entity to mix NAHASDA funding with low-income housing tax credits. Getting away from the competitive nature of HUD's prior funding into the formula fund freed us from annual competition, and it allowed us to partner with our sister organizations in Alaska. For example, the AVCP Regional Housing Authority in Southwest asked us to help them with their tax credit syndication and modeling. We actually helped another organization develop tax credit property off the road system that would not have been possible when we were competing for every single dollar in 8 separate programs every year.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from San Diego, Mr. Vargas. 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. I do apologize that I missed a little bit of the testimony at the beginning, so some of my questions may be repetitive, and I apologize for that at the outset. I do want to say that I was very thankful with the conversation that's been going with respect to how successful NAHASDA has been, the flexibility that is provided for Indian tribes. In fact, as just stated by Mr. Kolarek, I think you said that it placed the, I'm going to put words in your mouth, I think you said it put the control of the housing where it should be with the Indian tribes. Although you did mention California homes rotting in Alaska, I'm not sure about that. I may question that since I'm from California. But I did want to ask Mr. Hoskin, you're the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. I apologize that I missed your testimony. I was really anxious to hear your testimony about the Freedmen. I don't know if you spoke more extemporaneously other than your comments that you had here, but I would like to hear your view. You were praised by the chairperson of the full committee. Could I hear more of your testimony? And I apologize again that I wasn't here. I'll let you add to what you said earlier.
Thank you, Congressman, and I appreciate the kind words from the chairwoman of the committee. Quite simply, this is the law of the land in the Cherokee Nation: equality. Equality not stemming from necessarily recent actions, but equality recognizing that we made a sacred promise 155 years ago. If we believe that treaties are the law of the land, the United States should live up to their end of treaties, and we have to do the same. And if we look back to what our ancestors did, they agreed to equality. In the Treaty of 1866, they resolved that issue. 155 years passed, and it was not resolved. So we are undertaking efforts for reconciliation today. So not only legal equality on paper, but equality in action, making sure that every person that comes into a tribal office building or a program or service is treated equally based on the fact that they are a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And I would note, Congressman, that if you're a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, what signifies that is a card with your name on it, your birth date, and your citizenship number. And it doesn't have anything to do with your descendancy. It's whether you're a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and you're treated equal on that basis. We have to make sure that we practice that every day, so we have to make sure that any barriers that might have existed historically to access are knocked down. So, for example, my good friend Marilyn Van has mentioned CDIB cards, degrees of Indian blood. That idea is not relevant to a Cherokee Nation program or service because that is contrary to principles of equality in the Cherokee Nation. So those are just a few of the ways in which we're making sure we embrace the spirit of equality. And we're also undertaking efforts to look back at history and culture, artistic expressions of freedmen descendants that for too long have not been part of the Cherokee story. They are going to be part of the Cherokee story today. So I could speak a great deal on the subject. It's something that I think has made the Cherokee Nation a better nation, a stronger nation. I can only speak to how the Cherokee experience has gone. And I think other tribes may look at our experience, may look at our legal history, and they may find instruction based on what we've done and our experience.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. I do want to probe a little farther, if I could, with you. You said, sir, that it's been difficult to resolve over time, and that although it's been difficult, Obviously, you have a better nation, a stronger nation. Well, what made it difficult? Why was it difficult, and why is it difficult for other tribes?
Yeah, I can't speak to other tribes, but I can say in the Cherokee Nation, let's look at the Treaty of 1866. 1866, following that period of time, there is still a period of great change and tumult in Indian country, and then you find the imposition of the state of Oklahoma. And so for most of the 20th century, you find Indian nations, and I'll speak really only to the Cherokee Nation, a nation not allowed by the government of the United States to exercise its rights of self-government. And it's only when we get to the 1970s that we begin to pick ourselves back up. I think that interruption of many, many decades really arrested the development of the Cherokee Nation in terms of our civil society. And I think as we regained our footing and we had a century of, frankly, suppressing and denying the history of the freedmen, that it took some time for the body politic to sort of understand that history. That history simply wasn't taught a great deal, freedmen history. And I think as freedmen activists and advocates have raised that issue in the 1980s and the 1990s and in the 2000s, I think it came to penetrate the consciousness of Cherokee leaders, not only me, but certainly including me. That process takes time. And I think it's just the unique history of tribes, particularly within the state of Oklahoma, that caused some delay and difficulty in achieving that. There is something about a history that involves enslaving other people. I think the United States could relate to this. It just doesn't feel very good. And it's something for perhaps generations don't talk about. But we're talking about it today at the Cherokee Nation. I think we're a better nation for having done it. But when you don't talk about it, Congressman, you don't take action to correct it.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I appreciate the extra time. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steele, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walters, I think you'd agree that many tribes still face pretty significant housing challenges. It was noted that one of the last committee hearings on this topic was a remote hearing in the state of Wisconsin, hosted by our former colleague, Sean Duffy. I've spent time at some of the reservations in Wisconsin. I've seen this firsthand, that Native Americans in many ways are more likely to experience poor housing conditions and overcrowding in some other communities. And as we consider the NAHASDA reauthorization, I think it's important that we also discuss the regulatory and procedural issues in addition to the overall funding levels, that we're looking at process, not just dollars. And so a question that I'd like you to expound on, if you would, is ways that we can streamline the construction process for NAHASDA housing so that each dollar can go further. And should Congress consider any National Environmental Policy Act or other permitting reforms that would allow us to be more efficient with our spending?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's a very good place to start. I think the current NAHASDA draft bill includes provisions regarding the Environmental Protection Act. I think when tribes are developing housing, they're now using multiple sources of funding from different federal agencies, Treasury, DOI, HUD, USDA. So all of those agencies have their own rules and regulations, whether it's environmental or otherwise. Whereas the current draft bill, and to the extent now, tribes are undertaking housing projects with just HUD funding, they can control that environmental review process and all the other kind of administrative logistics work on their own. But when you start blending these other streams of funding in, you start running into that issue. Currently, the bill would allow the tribe to keep control of an environmental review process if the NAHASDA dollars were the primary source of funding. That's not necessarily realistic for a lot of these housing developments. These housing developments are usually $1 million projects, and they don't always have the most HUD funding out as part of that. They're going to blend a lot of other funding sources. So certainly easing the administrative burden will help a lot of tribes build more homes faster.
I think you bring up a really good point that there's multiple streams of funding that's going into many of these projects. Each stream of funding is going to have its own rules and regulations. Is there an approach that you think that would be successful in streamlining this to create more efficiency, or would you, as we look at kind of trying to streamline this, make this more efficient and remove some of the regulatory red tape that you're facing?
Well, I think it's a recognition that tribes are able to do this on their own. They're doing it now under HUD, under Indian Housing Block Grant dollars. So where they've shown that ability to do that and carry out those processes, there's no reason to make tribal housing programs jump through the hoops of other agencies just because the funding stream may have come from there. So to the extent possible, I would encourage where a tribe is building housing and they have that expertise built up over 25 years, to let them control the administrative processes under one process overall.
I appreciate your insight on that. I think there's a lot to be learned from your testimony there on the importance of local control, removing some of this regulatory red tape. We see this time and again here in Washington. Let me shift gears with my remaining time, if I can, to you, Mr. Brozzi. I want to step outside the housing discussion just for a moment and look at some of the broader financial challenges that many tribes are facing. We've heard from some of the witnesses here today about difficult circumstances in many tribal areas. I think improving access to financial services can be a really important component of our overall strategy to create more economic opportunity for tribal members. You noted some of this in your written testimony. Can you just comment on some of what you think are some of the clear impediments for financial inclusion that Congress should be looking at to address?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Steele. Again, taking it back to financial literacy, financial training, these are things that are often not taught in schools. They're taught in homes. And when we're dealing with Native communities, we're talking being in an economy, cash economy, for only a couple generations. So what Native CDFIs can do around financial literacy, financial education, credit building is very important, and we want Congress to support it 100%. One thought I had on the earlier question about streamlining dollars, there is for construction and making sure that they go the furthest, there is a movement toward eliminating what we call a dual or even triple taxation on development on Indian lands. And so that deals directly with the states. And I'm getting outside of what the Native CDFIs do, but I do think that if we really want to make sure that there is an incentive and not a disincentive for doing projects on tribal lands, states should be able to tax those operations at the same level and then not provide services there. There should be some sort of waiver. And some states are looking at this individually, but it would also could be a federal levels fix.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, and I'll just make a broad comment. The discussion we're having about whether or not to reauthorize a program that continues to be appropriated for really underscores the brokenness of the federal budgeting process. And just something I've noticed since I've been here, it's only my second term in Congress, is that whereas virtually every government that I've ever seen has a single bill budget, the federal government has an authorization process, technically a budgeting, and then a 12-bill appropriations process. That is a very unique budgeting process. It's the only place on earth that this process is attempted to be tried. In 45 years of trying it, we've actually only gotten 4 of budgets on time with this particular process. And unfortunately, you're the victims, right? I mean, you're trying to come and authorize a program that keeps getting appropriated for, but the authorizations are kind of an extraneous political exercise rather than actually having a real substantive policy thing. And so anyway, that's a process comment but you're here. And obviously this is an important program for your communities. And we've heard a lot of advocacy from the witnesses about the importance of flexibility, the ability to use this program as you see fit. And I just was going to throw it out. Are there any other additional flexibilities specifically that you would like to see? If you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. But you guys have already said it's in your written testimony. Yes.
Well, and I think this goes to some of the other questions we've heard from other members, is the flexibility regarding getting private capital and investment into Indian country. A lot of the questions have kind of geared towards where can tribal communities receive or reach out to tribal or private investment, but it's making private investment also work in tribal communities. There's a lot of tax credit programs that encourage banks and other lenders to participate in development across the country. And there's a lot of programs that have them emphasize underserved communities, but tribal communities are always the last group out of the underserved communities in this country, based on their geography, based on their land tenure, based on legal aspects. So adding flexibilities there and encouraging that partnership between tribes and capital and private markets will help overall development in the country.
So just to that end, as as someone who was in the banking industry for a while, and I was reading a 2017 HUD report, and I'll just read what it says. Mortgage lending in Indian country is made difficult by factors common to underserved markets of rural areas, pointing out that lending in Indian country is even more difficult because tribal land trusts cannot be alienated or encumbered. In other words, if I put a lien on a property, the judicial process may not be clear, whereas in Texas, where I'm from, you can foreclose and the bank can take the property if they're not paid their money. And so that special legal structure, I think, goes to the redlining that you referred to earlier, which is illegal under federal banking law. We don't allow banks to redline. But if you create this special legal structure, and that's a choice that you're making, I don't want to, maybe I'm incorrect on that. Maybe Congress needs to fix that for you. But the legal structure you've created has then in turn made it difficult for banks to come in and encumber land. And that may be different by tribe. And I'll let you, I just threw out a ton of stuff. Yes, Mr. Bossi.
I've got one more thing to add about Mr. And that is, we talked about bringing in outside investment and kind of thinking outside the box. One area that we wanted to touch on was bringing folks to the table with new market tax credits. Okay. This is something that is not new to the Financial Services Committee. Last year, Financial Services, I take back Ways and Means, held a hearing, and they sent a letter to the Treasury asking them why there has been almost $0 invested, less than 1% of allocations for new market tax credits going to Native-led operations, and including Native community development and CDFIs and CDEs. And there haven't been anyone in any Native-led organizations in the past 4 years who've received allocations despite need and capacity. And that's something that Congress has looked at, and I think it deserves additional looking at.
Well, going back to the question of encumbrances and foreclosures and just, the way property is structured in 50 states, but sometimes not necessarily. Do you want to speak to that? Like why you're structured that way, or should you change? Do we need to help you change that? Can you change that? Do you want to change that?
That's going to take us about an hour. Land title in Indian country, there are, I think, about 10 different layers. Oklahoma is different than the Navajo Nation where I'm from. But the area that we focus most on, or that we think has been the most difficult to develop, is tribal trust land. And we need to get folks from the Department of Interior and HUD together on the same page working with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Let me thank the witnesses for being here and apologize. This joint where we work sometimes creates conflicts, and so we had 5 votes, and you were sitting here waiting patiently for us. So we apologize for that. It happens all too frequently. So thank you very much. And under normal circumstances, we probably would have had another round of questions. We won't today, because I would have asked the question about whether or not it is true that some of the 5 tribes actually inflate their numbers in order to get a higher allocation of dollars. I'm not going to ask the question now or even bring it up, but I thought that it might have been a good question if we had had a little more time. So thank you very much, and I will remind the witnesses that all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email address provided to your office. Unless there is a comment from the chair. Meeting is adjourned.